Okay, I'm Steve Faulkner. I'm an assistant professor at Longwood University, and I write books. I take walks in a graveyard in Virginia because it's a good place to walk. And one day I got a call from my publisher, and he said that he thought it'd make a good movie, which I had never really thought of. It's a travel book. It's one of those kind of contemplative travel books where you wander around and meet people and introduce history and analyze the culture a little bit. And it was also a father-son story. I knew that because my son went on this 1,000-mile canoe trip with me. So it was kind of a combination of reflection, travel adventure, and father-son story. Sign that contract, you sign away your rights to intervene, and I knew that. But how often do you get a chance to have a movie made on your book? So I was willing to do that. They sent me the original screenplay, and then they asked for my input on that, and I did give them some input. I wrote some scenes, and I don't know to this day how much of that they've used. I haven't seen the film myself yet, so I'm in kind of fear and trepidation on how it's going to turn out. But they did change a lot of things. But it's still based on the journey that we took, which followed the 1673 epic journey of Marquette and Joliet, the French explorers, who were heading out west because they've heard of this big river that flowed from north to south, and they needed to know where it went. There were no maps, and they hired some Indian guides for part of the way, and part of the way they just went out into the wilderness until they finally came across the river that turned out to be the Mississippi. And they followed that all the way down, or almost all the way down to the Gulf, and then had to turn around and come back. We just took it one way. We didn't have to go back up current against the Mississippi. So I'd been overly busy, like a lot of modern Americans. I was working full-time, taking classes, trying to get my college education after I'd dropped out of school years before. And I needed an idea for a dissertation because I'd suddenly, near the end of my academic years there, I'd changed from Renaissance literature to creative writing. But in the process of all that and working nights and so forth, I'd really kind of lost contact with my boy who was growing up in the same house in the same city and all, but we hadn't spent much time. I'd spent a lot more time with his older brothers and sisters, and so I needed that time with him anyway, and I thought I could do both, spend time with him and go on this adventure, which I thought he'd like. He was rather resistant to that at first. He didn't know whether he wanted to spend that much time with me. So I kept a journal, and the reason was I'd run across a little children's book years before at a library sale. And I recognized the author because when I was a kid, I loved the books. They were dog books written by a guy named Jim Kilgard, Big Red, Irish Red. There this whole series I read when I was 10, 11, 12 years old. And I saw his name in this library book sale, so I pulled it out. And it was a biography of Marquette and of his journey out west. And so I bought it for, I don't know, a quarter or something. And I took it home and read it to my sons. And so that was in the back of my mind, and I was thinking, I love travel literature. I love travel writers who are also thinkers and care about the landscape and the people they run into. And maybe I could write about this. And so from the very beginning, I took a journal with me, and every week or so I would send the journal, put it in the mail and send it home from wherever we were because I was afraid of capsizing and losing it all. I read a lot of travel literature, and there are certain authors that I'm not sure if people have heard of, like Colin Thubron. He's a British travel writer. Jonathan Rabin is a pretty popular travel writer from England, lives now in the United States. Hilaire Belloc was a marvelous writer, British. And there's a number of others. Even a book like Huckleberry Finn is really kind of travel writing. And my son and I read Huckleberry Finn as we were floating down the Mississippi. So yeah, there's different kinds of travel literature. There's the tourist version of it. But students, you're right, they think of literature as fiction, maybe poetry, maybe drama, something like that. But what's called creative nonfiction has been coming on strong for the last 20 years. And I kind of like to call it reality literature, because students seem to be interested in vampires and wizards and dwarfs and goblins and all kinds of fantasy literature. That's what's popular now, from Harry Potter to The Lord of the Rings, Twilight, all of that. But I really think students are missing a lot by not observing their own world in detail. And maybe that comes from living in urban settings. We live in cities, and when we come home we turn on the television and we kind of live in those worlds, and the fictional fantasy worlds are more interesting than our everyday life in the big city. And that's one thing I want to do with my book. And the movie, I'm really pleased to say that it's shot largely on location. So they went to the places that we went. They've traveled up the rivers that we paddled up, and they show the actual scenes in many cases. So I'm glad of that, because I think my students and there's a lot of people who love nonfiction now too. I think it's, in a way, it's a stronger genre than fiction as far as sales go, because people want to read about the real world. They're interested in real life stories and not just what someone kind of makes up in their imagination. And I think it's a good thing, this idea that an author can present the world as he or she sees it and write it in a way that still interests the reader and present an adventure. And I think that's what keeps the reader going in all this. It's not just the reflections, but it's the adventure. They want to know what happens around the next bend. They want to know if anything exciting happens. So excitement is a part of it. I'm not against that in literature, but the real world is an amazing place. I mean, from the tiniest microscopic view of science all the way to the macroscopic view of the cosmos, who could have dreamed up something like this, you know? And that world is a fantasy in itself if we're just presented with it, and I think in a realistic way.